Welcome to Listening with China Blue. This is a podcast that focuses on how listening not only informs us about what is occurring in the world around us, but also helps us connect with others, build stronger businesses, strengthens our mental health, and become more creative and compassionate individuals. As more and more people practice attentive listening in a community, it becomes a community building practice that strengthens our mental health as we learn from our neighbors. I will be interviewing people from all walks of life to learn how listening has informed them in their field and helped them to make intelligent decisions. They will be artists, musicians, composers, dancers, business people, psychologists, neuroscientists, and Buddhists, to name a few. About me, I'm an internationally exhibiting sound-based artist. In my work, Discovering Unheard Sounds, I realized that the core component that drove my work was simply listening. That realization put me on the path of speaking about and helping people learn to become better listeners. I began with leading sound walks, which I continue to do in the upstate New York region to help people learn to listen from nature. And now, tune your ears to this podcast to learn about the power of listening. And do pay attention until the end for further information on how to start your own listening practice, share it with others, and to support Listening with China Blue. Today, we are speaking with David Amram. David has composed the scores for many films, including Hold My Daisy, Splendor in the Grass, and The Manchurian Candidate. He composed the scores for Joseph Papp's Shakespeare in the Park and premiered his comic opera Twelfth Night with Papp's libretto. He also wrote a second opera, The Final Ingredient, an opera of the Holocaust for ABC television. He has collaborated as a composer with Elia Kazan, Arthur Miller, Eugene Ormandy, Sir James Galway, Langston Hughes, and Jacques Amboise, and as a musician with Thelonious Monk, Johnny Depp, Hunter S. Thompson, Dizzy Gillespie, Odetta, Bob Dylan, Willie Nelson, Betty Carter, Floyd Red Crow Westerman, Arlo Guthrie, Pete Seeger, Paquito de Rivera, Tito Puente, and Jerry Jeff Walker. David, I am so honored to have you here today. Welcome.
Thank you, China.
It's so great to hear you and see you. And, I've been thinking so much about your work in relationship to listening to the beats. Now, you've done all this, you have this long history of working with beat poets and especially with Jack Kerouac. And I wanted to talk to you about what that was like and listening to the free verse, which was a style of the beat poetry that was influenced by the cadence of jazz. And I want to hear from you. Tell me more about it.
Well, if I could start off by quoting Duke Ellington, when he was asked, Mr. Ellington, can you give some good advice to young musicians or young people who would like to understand this ever-changing music that we call jazz, or any kind of music that requires quite a bit of attention? He said, listen. That was all he said. He could have written the title for your whole project, because what he said about listening. And then, of course, they said, well, tell us more. And he said, no, that's all I've got to say. Listen.
Wow.
And he was referring, I think, especially to instrumentalists who wanted to play this music and just couldn't figure out what to do when you had to stand up and there was no music on paper, or if you weren't that good a dancer and came to the dance hall where he played and you wanted to feel at home with the music, but you couldn't perhaps dance well enough to get out there and do that, you could listen. And the idea of listening is so important in every aspect of our lives, and especially when doing music, listening. And it was because of that when I first met Jack Kerouac, and prior, a few seconds before ever doing anything together, he looked like an unemployed French lumberjack at this bring your own bottle party, handed me a sheet a sheaf of papers right from his pocket. He took it out of his pocket, handed me, I guess it was some kind of poetry, and then took it back before I could read it
Oh, no.
and started reading. It said play. And I picked up the instruments I had with me. And sure enough, by listening, it was almost as if I couldn't go wrong.
Hmm.
And I felt psychically, if that makes any sense to your listeners, because I can't describe it, but I could intuitively feel him listening to me and drawing something out of me that I didn't know that was there. And I felt at the same time that by listening to him and trying to accompany the music that was in his poetry, that it told me what to do. When I wrote the opera Twelfth Night, Joseph Papp had taken the libretto, which he wrote as the words that a composer sets to music, chopped down Shakespeare's play so that the opera would be 2 hours long rather than 20 hours long by doing the whole play. And I thought, good Lord. Then I started reading just to myself. And then I tried to imagine listening to Shakespeare himself, or a wonderful actor that would take those beautiful words and say them so that you could hear them as well as read them and feel them. And it just told me what to do. So listening, in a certain sense, is an intuitive thing where you surrender yourself to the music that's already in the poetry. When you listen to the sounds of the winds, when I read about what you've done with music of whatever you want to call it, sounds from the different planets, even imagining them makes your imagination try to listen to something that you haven't even heard. And I think that listening is the key to everything. One of the great signs that I had during the Depression growing up. Now, I wasn't depressed. It was during the 1930s because I was born in 1930. So when I was 8, 9, 10 years old, it was still right in the heart of the Depression. Sometimes we would go with my father when we weren't working on our farm. We'd go to the airport and watch the local airport, watch the planes land and take off. That was exciting. And then we'd go down to the railroad close by in Somerton Springs and listen to the great sound of that Crusader, the silver streak of its day that went from Philadelphia to New York, and whoo, you hear that whistle when it by the steam engine, and it was loud and was moving fast, and hearing the railroad tracks and then the whoosh as the train disappeared and the whistle got more distant. And I used to listen to that whistle when I was up in our little room in the attic at the farmhouse and hear it off in the distance. And it made me dream of going to New York City someday on that train, hopefully, to do something, to see a band or see an orchestra, or do something that I had seen in movies but had never seen in real life. And one of the great things, of course, not at the summer and spring station, which had a little station house, but the places where railroads ran through the countryside, which it was then. You go to some country place that have those crossbars so that you wouldn't hopefully get hit by a train, and a sign that wasn't like this. It was a square, but it was put at an angle like that, and it would say stop, look, and listen. And the idea was, of course, you're supposed to stop, first of all. Then you're supposed to look to see if the train was coming, assuming that maybe the crossbars didn't work, but mostly to listen, because if you did, you'd know that that train was on the way. So listening was also a part of something that you learned to do living on a farm as a child with the sounds of the animals. When I used to milk the cow, I could hear it mooing in a certain way. And when I would hear it mooing, because it knew it was going to get fed and it knew it was going to get milked, it was very comforting, almost like a friend calling me or speaking to me, and hearing the chickens and the ducks and all the different animals and the wild animals all conversing was pretty amazing. One of the extraordinary things in listening, besides hearing cell phones, which I'll turn off, is, and I recommend all you listeners to this program, if you have a cell phone, please turn it off. Thank you. Uh, One of the things that I really learned about listening was when I went with a group of Native American people. I was conducting the Fairbanks Symphony, and they knew I played with Floyd, Westerman. They said, "We'd like you to come out, and we're going to show you how to talk to some mooses." I don't know the plural of moose, meese, something. At any rate, they made that sound, some kind of a sound like that. And sure enough, the moose answered them. I
Huh.
said, whoa. In other words, they could speak the moose language enough to communicate to get a response. So they said to me, look, you live on a farm now in uh, outside of uh, Peekskill, Peekskill, called Peekskill Hollow Farm, on about 9 miles from the town of Peekskill. They said, you have a farm there, right? I said, yes, I wanted my kids to have that experience, of seeing hard work and all that stuff and being in the 4-H. And they said, well, don't a lot of birds come there? And I say, yeah, well, we have chickens and ducks and turkeys. And they said, we mean the birds that fly around, the wingets, we call them. They get there by wing power. So we don't call them two-leggers or four-leggers. We call them wingets. I said, oh, sure. I said, and they say, well, do you have any wires? They said, don't they sit up on a wire? I said, yeah, they sit there all day long. I said, well, when you get back, you play all those little whistles. Why don't you see if you can talk to them? So I tried. They just looked at me quietly. For about 10 minutes, I tried to do everything that I thought was a bird call to get their attention. Then I psychically felt them saying, is he kidding? And I realized then they gave a little whistle and they all took off. I said, wow. I said, they could speak by listening to one another, bird talk. And that was a language I didn't know anything about except the cliches of what was supposed to be a bird call. That was not something I was listening to the birds carefully enough to replicate. But I think that it made me aware that listening also requires a state of mind and so humility to be able to hear, much less comprehend or speak all the different languages that are there,
For
whether
sure.
whether you know them or not. Just like
Of
reading
course.
about your sounds that you make with the sounds that planets make. I loved reading about it, and I'd like to hear it, but it makes me understand that I know nothing about that, and that maybe I would listen and hear it and not understand it.
Well, and getting back to the beats, you had mentioned to me that Kerouac was influenced about by how people spoke in Lowell.
Absolutely. There was a definite Lowell accent. And when you hear the film Pull My Daisy that he did the narration for, which he did spontaneously rather than trying to sound like a great English thespian, which which he could do. And one of the characters he suddenly sounded when he played when he introduced, it was a silent film, but most of the time he just sounded like a guy from Lowell. And when he used to always say to me, I'm an author, not an author, Davy. I'm a writer. Why don't they read the books I've written rather than the books about me? He had a definite way of speaking, which people speak if they are from that particular place. And the United States and the world, I guess, for that matter, used to have a way where you could almost identify where someone was from by the way they speak. And one of the tragic things that's happened recently, for the moment, is that many people have forgotten what we would call dialects or incorrect ways of speaking, and that they're all beautiful and all precious. And there are a lot of people who are studying regional speech. And Alexander Schneider, the great second violinist in the Budapest String Quartet and a wonderful conductor, said, there are many ways of playing this Mozart String Quartet, different than we do, but they're all correct. And by that, he meant when you listen to them, if you felt something, it was correct. So the idea of listening, I think you always strive to get the highest way of speaking the language, but then you have to understand what's considered to be dialects are also beautiful and also correct because you're listening to the psychic history of the people who speak that way. In French, if you try to study the way they speak French at the École de Lyon, the highest level, on peut parler parfaitement le français. Et en plus, toujours le subjonctif est le plus parfait. Well, when you go to Montreal, they say, ah, je suis Canadien français, je parle notre espèce de français totalement. Well, people would sometimes Parisians and especially New York City snobs that never been to France or to Montreal and don't realize that they're both great, don't understand that there's about 10 different Quebecois accents, and that speaking what they call joual, which is considered to be an incorrect dialect, is just as beautiful as Français propre. And when I conducted the Montreal Symphony, we had a woman who took me to school after I'd lived in Paris for a year and knew French fluently to start all over again. So when I would say, Bienvenue au concert, mes amis, welcome to the concert, my friend, she said, no, David, you must say for the children correctly, Bienvenue au concert, mes amis. And I got a free 8 years that I conducted the orchestra session in how to speak French as if I were a French diplomat. I didn't quite make it, but I loved doing it because it reminded me of listening to French being spoken by someone who spoke French well, and made me realize, that you can get into habits of speaking differently, and also made me understand the dilemma of many American politicians like Mr. Bush, when he said, "They gotta speak American, take them French fries and put them down the toilet and pour the wine down the toilet too. They gotta speak English." And I think he was right. First of all, I've and he should have applied that to himself so that he could learn to speak English properly. And secondly, when he spoke in a faux Texas accent, and all of his other family members spoke in the boarding school Eastern Seaboard establishment, Groton school of parlance of how to speak, they spoke a certain sort of imitation of English as is spoken by the well-to-do people. And in when you go to London, even today, the minute someone opens their mouth, you can tell what class they're from, more or less.
Of course, of course.
But of course, when you go to Manchester and then you get north, man, that's a whole different scene entirely, and just as wonderful. And sometimes the sound of the language, very subtle, it disappears when I try to when I came back from Cuba and I spoke French as I learned aprendí el español en la calle Rivera con los músicos latinos. I learned to speak French, Spanish in the street en la calle from the los músicos latinos, the musicians who play Latin music. Very often, people who never spoke to me because they all spoke English wouldn't speak to me in Spanish since I was not from that culture. Would say, "Hey, dime, ¿qué pasó, men?" I said, "Como? What?" I said, "Hey, dime, ¿qué pasó, men?" I said, "Excuse me, por favor, más despacio, más despacio. Soy un gringuito viejo. Please, quiet, slower. I'm an old, I'm an old gringo. I can't, slower." So they said, "Hey, baby, ¿qué pasó, man?" I said, "¿Cómo se dice man in inglés? How do you say, what does man mean in English?" They said, "Man is man, man." In others, they were using the word man and saying man. For the rest of it, "Hey, Davey, ¿qué pasó, man?" was, "Hey, Davey, ¿qué pasó, man?" Because in that style of speaking informally, there was a different way of doing it. And all of that relates to
David,
how
yes?
Jack
Oh,
spoke.
relates. Oh, great.
To
Tell me
to
more
answer
about Jack.
I promise not to get off the track. But when Jack spoke, he used the rhythms that you would hear in the cadences of jazz. So if he was rather than saying, "I went down to the store and bought myself some biscuits because I knew they'd taste good," he would say, "I went down to the store and bought myself some biscuits because I knew they'd taste good." And there was a certain cadence, many forms of cadence that came from a way of speaking or singing where you tried to stay within a rhythm. A lot of that came from the magnificent cadences of the sanctified church. And because most people of the Caucasian persuasion don't have the privilege of going to a sanctified church, or the desire or the realization that they might learn something about a whole part of America that's a blessing to the world and the way we speak and the way we live, you hear this fantastic use of the English language combined with all the traditions and everything that everybody has been through that goes to that church and the spirit of it. And when you hear the preachers, uh, and when they start talking about an Old Testament story and tell it in a certain way, and they start off very slowly and build up to this fantastic crescendo, it's just so inspiring and so beautiful. And it's the rhythm of the speaking, the way, the use of the language. This is something that Jack somehow picked up in Lowell And when he went to Booty Street and he heard the great jazz artists play, this influenced him as a writer and as a person. And I think it influenced all of us. I don't think, honestly, that most of his contemporaries had a remote idea of what he was doing because none of them really listened to jazz and surrendered themselves to the beauties of that and subtleties of that music, except for Lawrence Ferlinghetti and Gregory Corso to an extent because he respected it, and Gary Snyder certainly respected it, and you could hear. And they also were tuned in to the European classics, and most jazz artists also were interested in the European classics. So when we talk about listening, they were among the first people, aside from musicians that I would meet when I was playing with extra horn, way before I was playing with the extra horn with the National Symphony. I was sort of the orchestra mascot. I would sit up there and listen to the different ways the soloists would play. And when the Philadelphia Orchestra came, I'd listen to how the flute player, the great, great flute player, and also Mr. Kincaid and Marcel Tabito, the oboe player, when they played, whoa. But if I wasn't trained by other musicians to listen closely to how someone was playing something that I was already familiar with, I would have missed that language that they created, which came from their life and their way of interpreting what's on paper. And the same thing was true with Jacques and with Kerouac. Uh, Sometimes some of the so-called beat style of reading is a caricature of of what would be church-oriented style of speaking, and that's only because caricatures and what they now call appropriation is really damaging because you're taking something and misrepresenting it. Now, one of the things that all the great musicians told me, including the great African American musicians I was blessed to play with, was be yourself. Play how you feel it. Be you. Don't try to imitate us. You'll never be us. Be yourself. Take from us the root and then create your own, what you have to offer. And I think this was true in Jack's reading. I don't think he ever thought about that, but you could hear that influence. You also heard, if you paid close attention, aside from his Lowell way of speaking, that he was still someone, as he himself said, I speak in English, but I dream in French. There was a certain French Canadian influence in how he spoke. And when you go up to, especially in the province of Quebec, get outside of the big city of Montreal, you hear people that still speak the various forms of joual, and you hear a wonderful, beautiful musical way of speaking that's different. And that was in what he did too. And I think all of those elements of his listening to his own ancestral heartbeat and the beauties that surrounded him in the New World, and then going to Moody Street and leaving his family that still spoke French and leaving all the people and his buddies and the football team, like the Gonzalez family. The old folks still spoke Greek, and he was around, or they spoke English with a certain accent. All of that influenced him as well. And this is something that you learn about if you're interested enough to use listening powers and then think about what it is that you listen to.
And I wanted to interject that he provided the improvised narration over the film Pull My Daisy. And I was wondering, Pull My Daisy is considered the most important experimental film of the 20th century. And, this is a film that you composed for and was
And I was in it too.
an actor in it. So tell me about your experience putting together Pull My Daisy. It has so many of these interesting facets.
Well, I think the reason why they didn't film anybody being thrown out of the window was because it was a silent film. Gregory Corso leapt off the fire escape once to run out on the street and tell some poor woman in a convertible, I'm Fabien Fangoul, a movie star, and you can come up here, I'll make you a star, baby. Uh, she listened to him and started the accelerator and sped off because she just realized he was, nuts. But one of the reasons was Alfred Leslie, who directed it, who never was a terrific painter and never directed a film, spoke in a very, he was Mr. Bronx when he was a bodybuilder. He was
Oh,
but when he spoke, he didn't sound like a guy from the Bronx. He would speak very calmly and authoritatively, saying, please, Alan, do not take your pants off again when the camera's pointing towards you, because that's not what the scene is about. He would speak very as if he were a hostage negotiator speaking to a bunch of kindergarten dope fiends, which was probably what most of us would have been considered if anybody had covered I wouldn't say rehearsals, just the insane. I wrote about that in my book, Offbeat, collaborating with Kerouac, called Spontaneous Combustion, the chaotic making of Pull by Daisy. We just had a 3-week stoned out party, and our only thought was to see, since it was a silent film, if we could make Robert Frank, who was heroically using his little 16 millimeter camera and a wooden tripod, and he would laugh till tears were flowing down his cheeks, but he wouldn't shake the camera. And one of the sad things is that they never recorded any of the goings on that were happening during the filming of the jokes and insults and crazy stuff that was being yelled and shouted at. But I remember not only Jack's amazing spontaneous narration, but also the fact that Alfred, who somehow directed that, and he was the director because he had a place, and we put slugs in the fuse box so they could have enough light to film it. And listening to his soothing tones, trying to create some sense of order as if we were actually making a film. He actually had an idea. And the 50 hours of clowning around were chopped down to 27 minutes. And then he came in and took what we did and made it. Prochnik was his name. The editor made it 28 minutes long. Jack saw the ruination of what was actually written down on paper as being a play that we were supposed to do, and improvised the whole narration to the point where it made it look like we planned it that way. And I think it was Larry David who said it best when he was asked, when you made Seinfeld, how did you dare make a pilot for HBO with just a bunch of people sitting around in an apartment doing nothing, just hanging out? And he said, well, our inspiration was the film Pull My Daisy. We decided we make a television pilot and then a series out of nothing, because Pull My Daisy was a film about nothing. And
oh,
but this was what he said. Interestingly enough, the wife of in the film, the wife of the minister was Alice Neal. No one knew about Alice Neal except us. We were all just a bunch of friends, unemployed friends hanging out, hoping someday we could get our work appreciated. And Alice was terrific as an actress. The guy who played her husband, the minister, was Richard Bellamy, who had a little thing called the Green Gallery, which is where all the painters went who couldn't get with Sidney Janis. He was wonderful and terrific. The Allen Ginsberg, Gregory Corso, Peter Orlovsky, myself proved that we were not actors by our non-performances. Larry Rivers was the only person that was that well known aside from Jack, because Larry Rivers had been in the $64,000 question. And being on television, people were sort of familiar with him. So when the film came out, needless to say, no one was interested, no one was impressed. And by 1959, people were not aware enough of Jack to. I'm just turning this off. I'm sorry. Let me turn the whole thing off completely. Sorry, folks. By 1959, Jack's star had kind of diminished, and he was more or less out of fashion, not to people that loved reading his books, but to the pop schlock world. And so the only well-known person in terms of selling the film would have been Larry Rivers, who was a terrific painter. And he acted, and because he was supposed to play Neil Cassidy, he when you see the film, you say, boy, he could really play that alto saxophone. Actually, that was Sahib Shahab. I got to play the alto part, who watched Larry's fingers and said, hey, I don't have to hear it to play like it. He said, I can watch his fingers. I'll just play my stuff. And he sounded incredible. So I went to, sounded like Charlie Parker was playing or something. So I said to Larry, I said, how did you like that scene when you were playing the saxophone? He said, I never sounded better. But it was in the case of Sahib doing that, I played the French horn. They just did what I used, but the saxophone playing was extraordinary because Sahib Shahab, a great alto player who's I played with Oscar Pettiford's band and in his own group, and was an old friend. He could see Larry's fingers moving, and he could listen to probably what Larry would have liked to have played, and played, and it just sounded wonderful. And I only mention that because you wouldn't think that the art of listening would extend to being able to watch someone else playing on a without any sound and make it look and sound like it was really happening.
That's so interesting to hear it from your viewpoint. And while you were telling me about that, I was thinking also about how you had mentioned before about your work doing improvisation and with Dizzy Gillespie and Monk. And I wanted to hear a little bit from you about in the process of doing improv, listening must be a critical part of that.
Oh, of course, because when I would ask in the beginning, they'd say, "Come on and sit in." If you weren't in the band, they'd let people sometimes invite people to come and play on a tune at 2 in the morning. I'd say, "What key is it in?" The response, "You'll hear it." Then you'd say, "Well, what's the tempo?" "You'll hear it." Then the other thing is, "Well, what are the chord changes?" "You'll hear it." And then they just start playing. And if you didn't know what to do, you just lay out until you were given the signal it was your turn to play. And if you couldn't hear it by then, uh, someone else would play something. And it was terrifying, but very instructive. When I played with Charles Mingus, my first job in New York, 2 or 3 weeks after I was landed, coming off of a student ship as older than a student, just by a fluke. I was playing in Paris, and these guys came by and sat in with us and said, "We're going." So anyway, I got a free trip back, and I had the GI Bill to go to Manhattan School of Music. So I was to study composition, and I had Mingus had me come and play French horn at his quintet. Jackie McLean, incredible musician, would sit there and listen, and Mingus would sing us all of these parts that he had in his head of a composition that he'd written. And it wasn't just a 32 bar tune. He'd sing as the inner voices, the harmonies, parts, everything of a whole piece. I said, wow. I said to him, Mingus, that's incredible, man. You got all that stuff in your head. He said, well, we'll see how incredible it is tonight when you play it. And I said, are you really? He said, yeah. He said, we come here to create. You come tonight, you rehearse it at home. So we would go there, and then we play something completely different that he hadn't even planned on doing. Sometimes he wouldn't tell us, he'd just start playing. Then I got together with Jackie one night, and I said, Jackie, remember that part? You went, blah, 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 I'm a scalawoo, I'm sure you do, better do play. And you went, scalawoo, I'm shit it, did it, get it. He said, don't talk about that stuff, man. I said, what do you mean? He said, that's sacred stuff. He said, that's supposed to happen. You don't know where it came from. It's a mystery. It's from someplace else. But we don't talk about that stuff. That's sacred stuff. I said, wow. And what he meant was that in listening, you have to be prepared, as you do in every second of life, for anything to happen and to relate to it accordingly at the moment. When I would play with some of the great jam sessions with some of these wonderful musicians, a bunch of basketball players came. One guy came from, I think, from the Harlem Globetrotters. He said, man, you should come and see us play. I said, well, I've seen you on television a lot of times. Great. He said, no, come and see us. He said, that's our jazz. Some of those amazing things that we do are planned at the moment because of what someone else dictates and makes us do something we could never do or replicate, because the moment dictates what it is we're supposed to do. And I think so much in jazz emphasized that point. When Miles Davis said there's no wrong notes in jazz, he certainly didn't mean that you could just do anything. He meant if you play something that was not correct, you would use that as an ornamentation to go to the correct note. Or Charlie Parker took it to the real extent when he said, which I'm sure your listeners have heard, says, if you hit a real big wrong note, play it 3 or 4 times, then the people will feel that you meant it. So it's kind of the idea that if you're listening, if you're listening, you're discerning for some kind of a path that leads to something that becomes correct. Franz Klein explained that best when he said, to survive in the arts in America, you have to learn to slide into shortstop. I said, what?
What?
He said, no. I said, that's against the rules. He said, not if you do it. You say, here I am. So you do it about 20 times. That becomes part of your way of dealing with the situation. And it's the same thing, I think, with listening, that if you listen hard enough, as they say in the Bible, the crooked becomes straight, the crooked path becomes straight, or something. If that's in the Bible, or something like that.
Or you just slide into shortstop.
Yeah. But I think, that the thing that a lot of people in our era back in the 50s thought was that in jazz, people were just wiggling their fingers around and saying anything. And really, it came from hours and weeks and months and years of looking for notes and phrasing that fit into the harmonic structure of any particular tune. And secondly, what all the old jazz players told me was, anytime you're playing a song that which we used to do in those days before people composed their own pieces to play upon, that you had to learn the lyrics of that song so that when you were playing, it was almost you could help the listener to hear what you were doing by taking the words which are in your mind and making that a basis for the music that you're playing. And that was something that Jack really understood. One time when I did some for his nephew Jim Sampas, we took a tape which we never did use of him singing Funny Valentine. And sure enough, when I listened to it, no, he did a real da dee da, very slowly. And I said, then he paused, and then he started singing over it, but there was nothing he was singing over. Sure enough, I could hear it. He was singing all the right chord changes in his improvised little solo that he sang with no accompaniment. So he didn't have any chords to base his improvisations on except in his head. So he was listening in his mind to what a piano or a guitar player would be playing so that he would know what the harmonies were, and he knew where they were. He could actually hear that. And he was one of the first writers that wrote about Monk and Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie back in the 40s when he wrote On the Road, his descriptions. The one section I do all the time, which I did with him called Children, I called it Children of the American Bop Night. And it's sort of a history of jazz. And it's amazing. Somehow he got it. And it's because when he went, you knew he was paying attention and listening. And when he came to hear me play before we even met, I never realized that was the guy until he reminded me. He said, no, man, I was at the Bohemian. I heard you play there at the 5-spot before. I was with so-and-so. I said, good Lord, I didn't know that was you. And he said, no, he said, and after I got to know him, whenever he was there, you felt something when you were playing, even if people were stoned out of their head and talking and making noise or just trying to borrow money from someone or score some dope or whatever. Somehow you always felt the rare person that might be listening to the music and played for them. And sure enough, you could always feel whenever he was in a place because he was listening, really like a terrific listener. And I only mention that because in our society, someone who sits quietly and listens is considered that's a sign of weakness or being a nerd or being inarticulate or being antisocial. And the reality is, listening is the most powerful thing that you can do. And also, if anybody's listening to what you're doing, you have to give them great respect and gratitude for being able to listen.
And great respect and gratitude for what is being said, too.
Well, that's hopefully then, and most important, if someone is really listening to you, it makes you play or speak or think better yourself because you're not surrounded by the usual thing of whatever the response, the charming response that we get after you've unloaded your heavy philosophic tome on someone, and their response is whatever, or or and that's a wonderful catchword for changing tempos or for changing the conversation or for saying shut up. But sometimes, or to show your indifference to what's been said.
You know, as you're talking about this, and I was thinking about the fact that you had said earlier in an earlier conversation we had, you spoke about the radiators in your house and
Yes.
how the sound of their spewing somehow led you to polyrhythms and syncopation. And can you bring the audience up to speed on those thoughts? Because that
So,
was really an interesting segue that you made.
yes, well, sitting in the little farmhouse, aside from listening to birds and the various animals cooing, mooing, and occasionally fighting with each other or escaping the peril from the other animals who are going to eat them. Because in the farming world, there's a lot of what we would call cannibalism going on among the various species, a lot of friendship and community, but also a lot of what we consider to be homicide and violence. It's when the animals get hungry, they'll eat anything, and so will people, but animals even more so. Uh, but specifically, when you weren't hearing those heavenly sounds, we had the old steam radiators in the farmhouse, and being on the top floor, I was able to hear that clickety clack of the radiators and all of these different sounds. And I really got to enjoy it. And then I heard Big Sid Catlett and Gene Krupa and these other terrific drummers play and the big bands play. And then I'd hear the drum solo and I could hear what we call syncopation, which means more than one rhythm at the same time. At bong, 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 bong. If you have a syncopation, you go bong, gum, 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 gum. Bang, 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 bang. Etc. All the different wonderful rhythms that are there in the Wawanko in Cuba. All these different things and somehow they've fit together. And you learn those different patterns, and then you hear the people improvising. Then when you get, like I was lucky enough to do with the Los Muñequitos de Matanzas, the last time I was in Cuba, and I knew the four basic components of the Wawanko, so I knew if I heard one of them, I'd know where everybody was at. They didn't play any of this traditional stuff because they knew it in their minds. I said, whoa, but still I could feel it was totally together. And one of the players said, hey, David, you got a good foundation, but you don't use the ubading. I said, what's the ubading? I said, ubading, ubading, ubading. I said, oh. So I called up Alfredo, the wonderful Arturo O'Farrell, the great pianist, band leader, and the son of Chico O'Farrell, who's a master. I said, am I doing it right? He said, you got it, Davey. I said, it's in the right place. He said, yes, but it's floatable. I said, oh, in other words, if you knew the right place, you could also put it someplace else and it would be okay too. And everything would adjust to that. So I realized, and I asked Paquito de Rivera about that. And he said, no, I said, they have sometimes what they call the doctor of the clave. He said, those are the specialists. And sometimes you can find to do it either way. When I was there, and I hadn't been there in Cuba in 39 years old. I played with the musicians when they were constantly, but I heard a lot of things that I thought I knew had changed and advanced in certain ways. And when I hear different kinds of music, I find I can hear the same thing and it sounds different. So listening is an ongoing process, and it's a wonderful, wonderful thing to do. I always thought that Beethoven didn't lose his hearing. I just thought,
Really?
he finally said, I can't stand it anymore. So, so he just figured he didn't want to hear all that talk and have to have all the conversations and criticism and jealousy. So he just figured he'd just cut out everything. And when when they said that he couldn't hear, he probably just figured, I'd rather cool it and not. And I did this happen. Of course, that was just sort of a joke. But in real life, when I worked with Sesu Hayakawa in a play about a Japanese general that or officer and an American young pilot landed on an island, and neither the young American pilot or the Japanese officer knew that the war was over. They were trying to figure out how to get along with one another, and they were supposed to still be mortal enemies, and found a way to do that anyway. And the director was extremely nasty and picked on the other poor actor who was a younger guy and not well known, a fabulous actor. And he picked on me a little bit, but then he gave up because I was too positive thinking for him. I just said, yes, yes, just do what I wanted to. So we got to Philadelphia. Suddenly, I said, can I see Mr. Hayakawa? I was going to try to say something to him or just put a thumbs up. And I heard him saying, well, yes, of course, I didn't use the Stanislavski method. Rather, it was in this incredible conversation with someone from Channel 12. I remember that. I said, wow, Mr. Hayakawa, I didn't know you spoke English. He said, of course. He said, but I realized that this director had severe emotional problems. So I just thought I would short circuit any bad feelings by making him assume that I couldn't speak or understand a word of English. And I said, wow, he was listening to all that. He had to listen to all the screaming and shouting at the other poor actor. It was interesting. I didn't mean to get off the subject, but that's my specialty. But in the theater, working also when I would write music for especially for dramatic plays, I always felt I would look and listen to the actors and how they spoke. And if you did that, you almost would know what to write. John Frankenheimer told me in The Manchurian Candidate, he said, the film will tell you what to do. So in the one scene, I couldn't figure out that famous scene where they had the slow pan and the women that looked like they were all in a Savannah, Georgia tea party suddenly turned into North Korean soldiers, and they had one person shoot his friend in the head. I said, "What the hell is that?" And he said, "I have to make the audience feel that they're what it's like for those people to be using psychotropic drugs and be brainwashed." And he said, you have to do that with the music. So I started listening in my head, imagining if I was there, and I knew what to do, something I'd never done before or since. Sort of the harpsichord playing sounding like an Arnold Schoenberg outtake of a bad Viennese waltz, and Piccolo's screaming. I just picked the most unbearable, awful, wrong notes I could. And someone said, wasn't that hard? I said, no, because I've spent my whole life listening, searching for the choice notes, as they say. So I just took everything that when I listened to it in my mind, I thought was wrong, and it created the right feeling for an insane moment.
Oh, how beautiful. And David, it's the perfect moment to interject that I'm sorry I could listen to you forever, but we have run out of time.
Good, good for your mental peace. Well,
This is the perfect moment to stop.
and I send you and your listeners all my respect and love. And it's a thrill to be on your program, and I can hardly wait to see it and everything else that you do too, and your own music, which is terrific.
Oh, thank you so much. This was so exciting. Thank you for listening to this episode of Listening with China Blue. I hope it inspires you to build your own listening practice. This begins as a daily practice of attentively listening without judgment. And ask yourself, what is your version of silence? If you want to learn more about me and my work, go to chinablueart.com and please follow me on Facebook and at Instagram. Thank you.